A tense courtroom freezes as Judge Harrison Whitfield smirks, preparing to sentence Leroy Washington for trespassing. Just as the gavel descends, the doors burst open and Dr. Maya Washington strides in, clutching evidence that silences the room. Recognition flashes across the judge's face before he composes himself. The bailiff blocks Maya, but she holds up a USB drive declaring, "Before you sentence my father, you might want to see what's buried beneath that property." What dark secrets could be hidden under an abandoned building that would make a powerful... Judge pause. If you believe in fighting for justice even when the system is rigged against you, hit like and subscribe because tomorrow's episode reveals how decades of buried truths can change a community forever. Maya Washington's phone rang at 2:17 a.m., pulling her from a restless sleep after 18 hours of preparing for a landmark discrimination case in Chicago. The screen showed an unfamiliar number with the Oakwood area code, a place she had deliberately avoided for 15 years. Her thumb hovered over the decline button before a nagging sense of duty forced her to answer. "Dr. Washington speaking," she said, her voice professionally detached despite the hour. The caller identified himself as Officer Daniels from the Oakwood County Sheriff's Department. Her father, Leroy Washington, had been arrested for criminal trespassing at the old Fairchild estate. "Your father refused a public defender. He keeps asking for you specifically." Maya closed her eyes, the familiar mixture of love and frustration washing over her. "Is he hurt?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Just stubborn," came the reply, followed by a chuckle that made her skin crawl. "Though at 83, he shouldn't be breaking into condemned properties." Maya corrected him immediately. "My father is not a criminal. He's a respected elder in your community." The officer's tone changed. "Look, are you coming to handle this or not? Judge Whitfield doesn't take kindly to these cases dragging on. The mention of Judge Whitfield, Maya's blood ran cold. Harrison Whitfield had been a fixture in Oakwood's judicial system since she was a child, known for his harsh sentences against black defendants. She had argued before the Supreme Court, taken on corporate giants, and she still felt her throat tighten at the thought of facing him. "I'll be there by morning," she said, ending the call before checking flights. As she packed, memories flooded. Back of why she had left Oakwood. The constant microaggressions at her high school, despite being valedictorian. The college scholarship mysteriously rescinded. The police harassment of her father after he spoke at town meetings. She had escaped by earning a full ride to Harvard, vowing never to return to a place that had tried to diminish her at every turn. The Oakwood police station reeked of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Maya approached the front desk in her tailored suit, credentials from the Illinois Bar Association clearly displayed. "I'm here to see Leroy Washington. I'm his attorney and his daughter." The desk sergeant barely glanced up. "Take a seat. We'll get to you when we can." Maya checked her watch. "My father has been held for over 20 hours. I'd like to see him immediately." The sergeant looked her up and down. "You people always think your case is special. Everyone waits their turn here." Maya took a deep breath, recognizing the familiar pattern but refusing to rise to the bait. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just the legal right to counsel my client without unnecessary delay." 3 hours later, after watching several white attorneys escorted back immediately upon arrival, Maya was finally led to the interview room. Leroy Washington sat with his back straight, despite the uncomfortable metal chair, his weathered hands folded neatly on the table. His eyes lit up when Maya entered, though he maintained his dignified composure. "You didn't need to come all this way," he said, though the relief in his voice betrayed him. Maya embraced him briefly before taking the seat across from him. "What happened, Dad? Why were you at the Fairchild estate?" Leroy's eyes darted to the observation window. He leaned forward slightly and whispered, "They found out I know." Before Maya could press him further, the door opened and Officer Daniels entered, announcing their time was up. "We've barely had 5 minutes," Maya protested. "Department policy," he replied with a shrug that suggested the opposite. Maya immediately filed a motion for her father's temporary release, citing his age, community standing, and lack of criminal record. Despite obvious reluctance, The booking officer had no grounds to deny the request. They arrived at Leroy's modest home to find the windows smashed and racial slurs spray-painted across the front door. The word trespasser had been painted in bold red letters, but beneath it, partially visible through hasty brushstrokes, was a much more ominous threat. "Stay away from Fairchild." Maya called the police, but the responding officers spent more time questioning whether Leroy had provoked someone than documenting the vandalism. "This is clearly intimidation," Maya insisted, "related to his case." The officer closed his notebook. "Looks like teenage pranks to me, not worth filing a report." After the police left, Maya tried again to get answers from her father. "Why were you at that property, Dad? What's so important about it?" Leroy busied himself gathering supplies to clean the graffiti. "Just an old man being curious," he said, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. "I need to know what." "I'm defending you against," Maya pressed. Leroy shook his head. "Some things are better left alone, Maya. Maybe I should just plead guilty." Maya picked up the local newspaper left on the porch the next morning. The headline read, "Senile Elder Disrupts Development Project," with an unflattering photo of her father looking confused during his arrest. The article quoted sources close to the case describing Leroy as a troublemaker with possible dementia who had repeatedly harassed workers at the Fairchild property. The final paragraph mentioned the property's upcoming redevelopment into luxury condominiums, describing it as the cornerstone of Oakwood's revitalization efforts. While Leroy napped, exhausted from the ordeal, Maya searched his home office for clues. Behind his collection of historical books, she discovered a locked filing cabinet. Using the small key her father always kept on his keychain, she opened it to find dozens of folders meticulously labeled with dates going back 50 years. Each contained newspaper clippings, property records, maps, and handwritten notes about the Fairchild estate and surrounding areas. One map had red circles around several properties, including the Fairchild estate, with names of black families written beside them. Her father had been collecting this information for decades, building what looked like a case about land ownership. Maya pulled out her phone to take photos of everything when she heard her father's voice from the doorway. "Now you understand why they're afraid of an old man poking around abandoned property." The Oakwood County Courthouse stood as a monument to antebellum architecture, its columns and portico designed to intimidate as much as impress. Maya felt every eye on her as she walked up the steps with her father beside her, his head held high despite the whispers that followed them. Inside, the preliminary hearing was already packed with spectators, mostly white faces curious about the black attorney from Chicago defending the trespassing old man. Judge Harrison Whitfield entered the courtroom with the confident stride of someone who had never had his authority questioned. His silver hair and tailored robe couldn't hide the contemptuous look he cast toward Leroy before taking his seat at the bench. Maya immediately noticed his comfortable exchange with District Attorney William Prescott, who leaned in to share what appeared to be a joke. Both men laughed as they glanced toward the defense table. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Whitfield," the bailiff called. Though the judge and DA had already been casually chatting for minutes, the charges against Leroy Washington were read with theatrical gravity, as though he had committed a violent felony rather than allegedly walking onto an abandoned property. "The defendant is charged with criminal trespassing, destruction of private property, and resisting arrest," DA Prescott announced. Maya immediately objected. "Your Honor, the police report mentions only trespassing. These additional charges are not in any documentation we've received." Judge Whitfield waved his hand dismissively. "The prosecution has latitude to amend charges as evidence develops, Counselor. Perhaps in Chicago you're used to more leniency." The barely concealed racism in his tone made several spectators smirk. DA Prescott then launched into a character assassination, describing Leroy as a danger to the community who had violently resisted officers and repeatedly harassed workers at a vital economic development project. Maya watched in disbelief as he portrayed her 83-year-old father as a threat to public safety. When she attempted to object to this mischaracterization, Judge Whitfield cut her off. Save your theatrics for the trial, Dr. Washington. This is Oakwood, not your liberal Chicago courtrooms. A representative from Whitfield Development Corporation, a sharply dressed young man named Bradley Thompson, was called to address the court about the property damage. Maya's eyebrows rose at the company name, looking between the judge and the corporate representative. "For the record," she interjected, "is Whitfield Development related to Your Honor in any way?" The courtroom fell silent. Judge Whitfield's face hardened. "Whitfield is a common name in this county, Dr. Washington. Are you implying something inappropriate?" Maya held his gaze. "I'm simply establishing facts relevant to potential recusal considerations." The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. "Your motion for recusal is denied. Proceed, Mr. Thompson." The corporate representative detailed extensive damage to locks and barriers at the property, requesting maximum penalties and significant restitution. When Maya asked to see documentation of this alleged damage, Judge Whitfield intervened. "The court accepts Mr. Thompson's testimony as an officer of the corporation. No further evidence is necessary at this stage." Maya had spent the previous night reviewing Judge Whitfield's case history, uncovering a disturbing pattern. In cases with similar charges, white defendants typically received warnings or community service, while black defendants faced maximum fines and jail time. After the corporate testimony, Maya presented a motion to dismiss based on selective prosecution, citing 20 comparable cases with vastly different outcomes based on the defendant's race. "Your Honor, the disparate treatment of defendants based on racial identity represents a clear violation of equal protection under the law." Judge Whitfield's face flushed with anger. "Dr. Washington, I will not have my courtroom turned into a platform for baseless accusations of racial bias. Your motion is denied." Every procedural motion Maya filed met the same immediate rejection. When she requested standard discovery materials, the judge claimed security concerns justified limited disclosure. When she moved for a continuance, to properly prepare, he cited community interest in swift justice. During a brief recess, Maya slipped away to the county clerk's office to request historical records on the Fairchild property. The clerk, a nervous woman with darting eyes, whispered, "Those records were moved to secure storage last month. Special request from upstairs." Maya pressed, "I need to see the chain of title and any zoning changes for my client's defense." The clerk shook her head. "System says those files are misplaced. Could take weeks to locate them." On her way back to the courtroom, Maya passed a bulletin board with recent county notices. A permit approval for Whitfield Heights luxury condominiums caught her eye, with an expedited construction schedule beginning just 2 weeks after her father's trial date. The development company had already begun pre-selling units, despite not having final approval. When she returned to the courtroom, Judge Whitfield was setting an unusually accelerated trial schedule. Given the straightforward nature of these charges and the defendant's age, this court sees no reason for delay. Trial will commence next Monday. As Maya packed her documents after the hearing, an elderly black man in janitorial clothing shuffled past her bench, quietly sweeping. As he passed, he deliberately dropped a crumpled paper near her feet. Without making eye contact, he continued down the aisle. Maya retrieved the note, unfolding it to find a message in shaky handwriting. "County Archives, basement of old library. Ask for Roosevelt. Your daddy not the first." She slipped the note into her pocket, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. As she and Leroy walked to her rental car, he squeezed her hand. "You see now, the game is rigged before we even sit. At the table." Maya nodded, her determination hardening. "Then we'll flip the table, Dad." The drive back to Leroy's house took them past the Fairchild estate, a once grand property now falling into disrepair behind chain-link fencing and no trespassing signs. Maya slowed the car, studying the overgrown grounds and boarded windows. "What's so special about this place, Dad? You need to tell me." Leroy stared at the property, his eyes distant with memory. "In time," was all he said. As they turned onto the main road, Maya noticed a black SUV with tinted windows pull out behind them. The vehicle stayed close, its high beams flashing periodically in her rearview mirror. When she increased her speed, the SUV accelerated. When she slowed, It maintained an uncomfortably close distance. Maya took a series of random turns, confirming her suspicion that they were being followed. On a particularly deserted stretch of road, the SUV suddenly swerved into the oncoming lane and accelerated alongside them. Through the passenger window, Maya glimpsed a man in sunglasses, pointing what appeared to be a camera at them before the vehicle cut sharply in front of her car, forcing her to brake hard and swerve onto the shoulder. By the time she regained control, the SUV had disappeared down a side road, leaving them shaken but unharmed. What would you do if the justice system itself became your greatest obstacle? Has there ever been a moment when you realized the cards were stacked against you from the beginning? Comment number 1 if you believe Judge Whitfield should recuse himself for his obvious conflict of interest, or number 2 if you think Maya should report this case to higher authorities immediately. If you're invested in seeing how this family fights against a corrupt system, like and subscribe to support stories that expose injustice. What secrets could be hidden in those missing records that have powerful people so afraid of an elderly man looking at an abandoned property? The answer may shake an entire community to its core. The old library stood in stark contrast to the modernized downtown, its brick facade darkened with age and neglect since the new facility had opened across town. Maya parked a block away and surveyed the area before approaching, her encounter on the road the previous day having left her cautious. The main entrance was locked, but a small sign directed visitors to the basement access via exterior stairs. The musty scent of old paper and dust greeted her as she descended. Inside, the basement had been converted to storage, with rows of metal shelving holding boxes of civic records too old or mundane to merit digitization. An elderly white woman with thick glasses looked up from a desk cluttered with paperwork. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neither welcoming nor hostile. "I'm looking for Roosevelt," Maya said, keeping her voice low. The woman studied her for a long moment before pointing to a door marked County Historical Society. "Through there. He only comes Tuesdays and Thursdays." Maya thanked her and walked toward the indicated door, feeling the woman's eyes follow her. The Historical Society room was larger than it appeared from outside, with walls lined with photographs of oak wood through the decades. A silver-haired black man sat at a table repairing the binding on an old ledger. He looked up as Maya entered, recognition flashing in his eyes. "You must be Leroy's girl," he said without preamble. "The janitor said you might come." Maya approached, cautiously. "Are you Roosevelt?" The man nodded, setting aside his work. "Roosevelt Jenkins, but most folks just call me Mr. Ross. I've been the archivist here for 42 years, though the county prefers to call me the maintenance supervisor. On paper?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "I suspect you're looking for something specific, and I suspect I know what it is." Maya took the offered seat. "I need to understand why my father was at the Fairchild estate, and why powerful people are so determined to punish him for it." Roosevelt's face grew solemn. "That property has a history they've tried to bury, literally and figuratively. Your father knows pieces of it. I know most of it. Together, we might have the whole truth." For the next 3 hours, Roosevelt guided Maya through records that painted a very different picture of the Fairchild estate than the abandoned property it appeared to be today. Historical maps from the 1920s showed the area had once been a thriving black community called Freedomville, established by formerly enslaved people who had purchased land after the Civil War. This was one of the most successful independent black townships in the state, Roosevelt explained, pointing to photographs of well-maintained homes, businesses, and a church. By the 1940s, they had their own school, medical clinic, and nearly 300 acres of farmland divided among 53 families. He pulled out property deeds showing the original purchases, including one with the name Washington, clearly visible. "Your grandfather, Elijah Washington, owned 20 acres on the eastern edge of the community, good farmland that had been in the family for 2 generations by the time the Troubles started." Maya stared at the document, a piece of her family history she had never known. "What happened?" she asked, though the knot in her stomach suggested she already knew. Roosevelt pulled out newspaper clippings from the early 1950s, Headlines announced a major highway project and urban renewal initiative targeting the area. The official story was progress, he said bitterly. The reality was theft. Environmental surveys from the period showed the proposed highway would have bypassed Freedomville entirely, but the plans had been altered to cut directly through the heart of the community. Eminent domain is the legal term, Roosevelt continued, but there was nothing legal about how it was applied. Court records revealed that landowners had been given less than 30 days to accept offers far below market value. Those who refused faced immediate condemnation proceedings before Judge Walter Whitfield, Harrison Whitfield's father. Every single challenge was denied, every appeal rejected, and once the families were displaced, the highway plans mysteriously changed again. The highway was ultimately built 5 miles east, leaving the seized land vacant but no longer in black ownership. Property records showed the land had been purchased at tax auctions by shell companies that all traced back to 3 white families, with the Whitfields acquiring the largest portion. Maya's hands trembled as she photographed document after document. This wasn't just about one community, was it? Roosevelt shook his head grimly. I've traced similar patterns across 7 counties, thriving black communities targeted, residents forced out through legal manipulation, environmental threats, or sometimes outright violence, then the land acquired by the same network of families and companies. He showed her a pattern of land transfers and corporate structures that, when mapped over time, revealed a systematic campaign of displacement spanning decades. The Fairchild name only came later, when they needed to distance themselves from the original theft, but Whitfield Development is the culmination of 3 generations of stolen wealth. Maya thought of the luxury condominiums being advertised. And now they're finally developing the land. Roosevelt's expression darkened. That's what doesn't make sense. Why now, after all these years? Something's changed, something that made them accelerate their timeline. He glanced at his watch suddenly, his demeanor shifting to urgency. You need to go. Security does rounds at 4, and they've been instructed to be especially vigilant. It's about these records. As Maya gathered the copies Roosevelt had helped her make, raised voices echoed from the main room. Maya peeked through the door to see 2 uniformed security guards questioning the elderly librarian. We received a report of unauthorized access to restricted county records, one stated loudly. A woman matching Dr. Washington's description was seen entering this building. The librarian blinked innocently behind her thick glasses. I haven't seen anyone all afternoon except Mr. Ross working on his old books. Roosevelt quickly guided Maya to a service door, partly hidden behind a filing cabinet. This leads to the maintenance tunnel. Follow it to the end, turn left, and you'll come out behind the parking garage 2 blocks over. He pressed a flash drive into her hand. I've been digitizing these records for years, preparing for this day. Everything I've shown you and more is here. Your father was right to keep digging, but he doesn't know the worst of it yet. Maya hesitated. What do you mean? Roosevelt's voice dropped to a whisper. The reason they're developing now. It's not about profit. It's about covering up what's under that soil before anyone can test it. Maya's evasion of the security guards proved successful, but her victory was short-lived. When she arrived at her father's house, the front door stood ajar. Inside, chairs were overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, and the filing cabinet in Leroy's office had been broken open, its contents gone. Most alarming was the absence of Leroy himself. No note, no sign of where he had gone. Blood spots on the kitchen floor suggested he hadn't left willingly. Maya immediately called the police, who arrived nearly an hour later, despite the house being less than 5 minutes from the station. The responding officers walked through the house with casual indifference. Looks like a standard burglary, one commented, kicking aside scattered papers. These older neighborhoods don't have the security of the new developments. When Maya pointed out the blood and her father's disappearance, the officer shrugged. Probably cut himself during the break-in and got confused. Elderly folks wander off sometimes, he'll turn up. No forensics team was called, no Amber Alert issued. The officer handed Maya a standard incident report form. Fill this out if you want to claim insurance. As for your father, wait 24 hours. He's probably at a friend's house and forgot to tell you. After the police left, Maya called every friend and acquaintance of her father's that she could remember or find in his address book. No one had seen him. She drove through the neighborhoods he frequented, checked the hospital, and returned to the house repeatedly, hoping he might have come back. As midnight approached, she sat amid the destruction of her father's home, exhaustion and fear threatening to overwhelm her. Her phone rang, the screen showing unknown number. She answered immediately. "Dad?" Her digitally altered voice responded, "Your father is fine for now. Drop the case, destroy the evidence you collected today, and leave Oakwood by morning. Otherwise, you'll be bringing his body back to Chicago instead." Before she could respond, the call ended. Maya stared at the phone, terror giving way to a cold, focused rage. She had faced intimidation before from powerful opponents, but never so bluntly, never targeting her family. She picked up the flash drive Roosevelt had given her, clutching it tightly. Whatever was hidden beneath the Fairchild estate, it was worth killing to protect. And now, they had her father. Dawn broke over Oakwood as Maya accelerated down back roads, alternating routes and checking constantly for followers. She had spent the night converting Leroy's garage into an impromptu case headquarters, pinning maps and timelines to the walls, and securing the space with additional locks purchased from a 24-hour hardware store. Sleep had been impossible after the threatening call. Her father was being held somewhere in Oakwood, and the only leverage she had was the information on Roosevelt's flash drive. A strategic decision crystallized in her mind. She would continue, preparing her father's legal defense, while simultaneously launching her own investigation to find him. The public face of compliance would buy her time while she worked behind the scenes. The Oakwood police were clearly compromised, so she called an old colleague from her days at the Justice Department, requesting discreet assistance locating cell tower data from her father's phone. The morning news on the local station featured a segment that made Maya's blood boil. "Controversy continues over the arrest of local troublemaker Leroy Washington," the anchor began, as his daughter, a Chicago attorney with ties to radical activist groups, disrupts court proceedings with unfounded accusations of racism. The report included edited clips from the preliminary hearing that made Maya appear aggressive and unprofessional, followed by interviews with concerned citizens, describing the Fairchild development as essential to Oakwood's economic future. The final blow came from Mayor Samuel Whitfield, Judge Harrison's younger brother. "It's unfortunate when outside agitators try to import big city politics into our peaceful community," he stated smoothly. "Mr. Washington has a history of making inflammatory claims, and now his daughter seems determined to continue that unfortunate tradition. The character assassination was calculated and comprehensive, designed to isolate Maya from potential local support." Undeterred, Maya spent the morning at the county assessor's office, requesting property records for all Whitfield family holdings. The clerk's eyes widened at her request. "That would be hundreds of properties across multiple companies and trusts," she stammered. "It could take weeks to compile." Maya smiled pleasantly. "I'll wait." After several tense phone calls to supervisors, the clerk reluctantly provided access to the digital database. The pattern that emerged was staggering. Judge Whitfield personally owned 30 residential properties and held interests in commercial developments throughout the county. His family trust controlled hundreds more through a network of LLCs and holding companies. Most significantly, many of these acquisitions could be traced back to formerly black-owned properties in communities that had mysteriously failed over the decades. Mapping these properties against Roosevelt's historical records of Freedomville and similar communities revealed a systematic pattern of dispossession and wealth transfer spanning 3 generations. Even more disturbing were the connections that emerged between Oakwood's power structure and the Fairchild development specifically. Mayor Whitfield was listed as a silent partner in Whitfield Development Corporation. District Attorney Prescott's wife sat on the board. The police chief, 3 city council members, and the head of the county zoning commission all held shares in the company or related ventures. This wasn't simply a case of a biased judge. It was a comprehensive network of influential figures with direct financial interest in ensuring the development proceeded without scrutiny of its origins. The final piece fell into place when Maya discovered that Judge Whitfield had personally signed off on eminent domain proceedings against 28 property owners over his career, with 85% of those properties eventually acquired by companies connected to his family or associates. The judicial system itself had been weaponized as a tool of racial dispossession. As Maya left the assessor's office, her phone rang with news from her Chicago office. "Maya, there's something strange happening," her assistant reported. "The Illinois Bar Association just called saying they've received multiple complaints about your practice, triggering an ethics investigation." Maya gripped the phone tighter. "What complaints?" "Allegedly falsifying evidence in the Westbrook case," witness. "Intimidation in Collins versus State, misappropriation of client funds." Maya interrupted. "Those are all completely fabricated. The Westbrook case was 3 years ago and received judicial commendation. Collins was settled with full agreement from all parties." Her assistant's voice lowered. "I know that, but they're freezing your operating accounts pending investigation. And Maya, they specifically mentioned your work in Oakwood as concerning." The message was clear. They were attacking her professional standing, her reputation, and her financial stability simultaneously. Returning to her car, Maya found a parking ticket on her windshield, despite having over an hour left on the meter. The amount was $500 for blocking emergency access, though her car was nowhere near any emergency zone. Maya had just finished updating her digital evidence files at a local coffee shop when her burner phone rang, the one whose number only her Justice Department contact had. "We traced your father's phone," the voice said without introduction. "Last signal was from an industrial area on the outskirts of town. Phone's been off since yesterday evening, but it remained at that location for several hours before going dark." Maya thanked him and immediately pulled up satellite imagery of the area. It showed a cluster of warehouses and storage facilities on property owned by, predictably, a subsidiary of Whitfield Development. With night approaching, Maya drove to the location, parking several blocks away and approaching on foot. Most of the buildings appeared inactive, but one smaller structure at the back of the complex showed signs of recent activity: fresh tire, tracks in the mud, and a newly installed padlock on the door. Moving silently around the perimeter, Maya found a partially open window near the rear of the building. The interior was dark, but she could make out the silhouette of a figure seated in the center of the room. Heart pounding, she slipped through the window and crept forward. "Dad?" she whispered. The figure stirred. "Maya?" came the weakened but unmistakable voice of Leroy Washington. She rushed forward to find her father handcuffed to a metal chair, dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. "They left about an hour ago," he rasped as she worked to free him. "Said they'd be back to move me. Something about making it look like I'd fled prosecution." As Maya helped him to his feet, he clutched her arm urgently. "Did you find Roosevelt? Did he show you the maps?" Maya nodded, supporting his weight as they moved toward the window. "He showed me everything, Dad. The original deeds, the eminent domain fraud, all of it." Leroy's eyes burned with intense purpose, despite his weakened state. "Not everything. I've been tracking this for 50 years, ever since they took our land. There's something on that property they're desperate to keep hidden." With her father safely hidden at a motel outside city limits, registered under a false name using cash, Maya returned to their investigation with renewed determination. Leroy, recovering his strength with food and rest, spread out his own research. Materials that he had hidden in a safe deposit box the bank had not known to search. "I always knew they might come from my files at home," he explained. "I've been careful about where I keep the most damning evidence." Together, they reconstructed the history of Freedomville and the systematic destruction of black land ownership in Oakwood County. Leroy had spent decades interviewing displaced residents, collecting affidavits, and tracing property records across 5 states to document the network of corruption. "But there's still a missing piece," he insisted. "Why? Are they suddenly developing the land after leaving it vacant for nearly 70 years? And why start with the Fairchild estate specifically?" The answer came as dawn approached. Comparing Roosevelt's environmental surveys with Leroy's maps revealed a disturbing pattern. The Fairchild estate sat at the lowest elevation point of the former Freedomville community, where groundwater would naturally collect. In the 1960s, Leroy explained, after they'd seized all the land, Whitfield Industries operated a chemical processing plant 2 miles upstream. No environmental regulations back then. He pointed to newspaper clippings documenting mysterious illness in the remaining black neighborhoods downstream from the plant. They closed it after 5 years, claimed it wasn't profitable. But I always suspected. He trailed off as Maya pieced it together. They were dumping toxic waste, and it would have flowed directly to where the Fairchild estate sits now. Leroy nodded grimly. Build luxury condos with deep foundations, pave everything, over, and nobody ever digs deep enough to find what's underneath. As morning light filtered through the motel curtains, Leroy insisted on showing Maya one final piece of evidence, something so sensitive he hadn't dared document it in his files. They drove in silence to the far edge of the Fairchild property, where the land backed up against a densely wooded area. Leroy led her through a barely visible path until they reached a small clearing. What appeared at first glance to be natural mounds in the forest floor revealed themselves upon closer inspection to be weathered headstones, dozens of them partially reclaimed by nature. "The Freedomville Cemetery," Leroy said softly. So they seized the land. They said they'd relocate the graves. They never did. Maya moved among the stones, reading names and dates worn by time. Many stones bore the names of Oakwood's founding black families, including several marked Washington. "This is sacred ground," Leroy continued, "and they're about to pave over it without a word to the descendants." Maya knelt beside a small headstone marked only Baby Grace, 1943. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not only had the Whitfields stolen the land and poisoned the environment, but they were now preparing to erase all evidence of both crimes, along with the physical proof that black families had ever legitimately owned this land. As they made their way back to the car, Maya sensed movement in the trees behind them. "Dad," she whispered, "walk faster." They had nearly reached the road when 2 men in dark clothing emerged from the woods ahead, cutting off their path. "Dr. Washington," one called. "What a surprise finding you trespassing, just like your father." Maya pushed Leroy behind her protectively. "This is public land. The property line is 20 feet back." The man smiled coldly. "Is it? I think Judge Whitfield might disagree." As they advanced, Maya backed away, guiding her father toward a different path. Suddenly, the crack of a branch behind them revealed 2 more men approaching from the rear. They were surrounded. Maya's mind raced through options as the men closed in. Using her father's cane as leverage, she suddenly shoved one man into another, creating momentary confusion. "Run!" she shouted, pulling her father toward the thickest part of the woods. Their pursuers recovered quickly, but Maya and Leroy's knowledge of the terrain gave them a crucial advantage. They navigated the underbrush at a desperate pace, emerging onto a residential street where an early morning jogger provided an unwitting deterrent to their pursuers. Maya flagged down a passing car, a startled woman stopping at the sight of their disheveled appearance. "Please," Maya gasped, "my father needs medical help." The woman, recognizing the genuine fear in their eyes, drove them to the county hospital, where Leroy was immediately taken for treatment of exhaustion and dehydration, while Maya kept watch, knowing their reprieve was only temporary. Have you ever discovered a truth so devastating it made you question everything about your community? Would you risk your safety to expose generations of injustice, or would self-preservation win out? Comment number 1 if you think Maya should release all her evidence to the media immediately. Or number 2, if you believe she should continue gathering proof before going public. Like and subscribe if you believe in standing up against powerful interests that try to bury history. What would you do if you discovered your family's land had been stolen through corrupt legal maneuvers? The Washington family is about to face even greater dangers as they challenge a system built on decades of deception. The sterile hospital corridor provided no comfort as Maya paced outside her father's room, phone pressed to her ear. Her law school mentor, Professor Eleanor Bennett, listened intently as Maya outlined the situation. "This goes beyond a simple trespassing case, beyond even the land theft," Maya explained, keeping her voice low. They've created an entire system to protect their crimes. The judiciary, local government, law enforcement, all compromised. Professor Bennett's response was measured, but supportive. What you're describing is precisely why I always told you institutional racism requires institutional remedies. Your father's case could be the lever that moves an entire corrupt system, but you can't do it alone. By the time they ended the call, a plan had formed. Professor Bennett would send a team of her best law students, ostensibly for a project, on rural property law, providing Maya with both research support and witnesses to any further intimidation. Meanwhile, Maya would prepare a comprehensive legal strategy addressing not just her father's trespassing charge, but the underlying historical injustice. The courthouse clerk's office seemed determined to obstruct Maya's every filing. "This motion is on the wrong color paper," the clerk stated flatly, sliding the document back across the counter. Maya kept her expression neutral. "There's no rule specifying paper color for defense motions." The clerk shrugged. "Judge Whitfield prefers blue paper for motions to dismiss. This will need to be refiled." When Maya returned with the identical motion on blue paper, the clerk found a different objection. "The margins are incorrect." After the third rejection for increasingly trivial reasons, Maya confronted the clerk directly. "These obstructions are being documented as part of a pattern of procedural prejudice. I filed identical motions in federal court that were accepted without issue." The clerk's eyes darted nervously to her supervisor's office before finally accepting the documents, though Maya had no doubt they would accidentally be misplaced before reaching Judge Whitfield's desk. Court was called to session 3 days later with an unexpected development. Seated beside the district attorney was Bradley Thompson, the same representative from Whitfield Development who had testified at the preliminary hearing, now introduced as special counsel to the prosecution. His law firm, Cromwell & Stein, represented major corporations throughout the state. "Your Honor," Maya objected immediately, "the addition of private counsel to a criminal trespassing case represents an unusual interest by Whitfield Development in the outcome. I move again for your recusal, given this clear connection to the corporation bearing your family name." Judge Whitfield's face reddened. "Motion denied. Mr. Thompson has been appointed as a special prosecutor at the district attorney's request, which is well within his authority. Any further spurious motions for recusal will result in contempt charges, Dr. Washington." Thompson proved immediately why he had been brought in, systematically challenging every witness on Maya's list. "Your Honor, these so-called historians have no direct knowledge of the alleged trespassing incident. Their testimony about historical land ownership is irrelevant to the current charges." One by one, Judge Whitfield struck Maya's witnesses from the approved list. Elderly former residents of Freedomville who could testify to the community's existence and destruction, land surveyors who could confirm property line disputes. Even Roosevelt Jenkins was deemed lacking relevant expertise, despite his decades as county archivist. As the list of permitted witnesses dwindled to nearly none, Maya received increasingly concerned messages from those still willing to testify. A retired teacher who had documented Freedomville's history reported threatening phone calls. A former county employee who had saved copies of the original eminent domain proceedings found her car vandalized. By afternoon, half of Maya's remaining witnesses had withdrawn out of fear for their safety. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. Professor Bennett arrived with 6 law students, each carrying boxes of research materials and digital equipment. "We're here to observe proceedings as part of our clinical program on property law and civil rights," she announced crisply, presenting Judge Whitfield with authorization from their law school and the State Bar Association. Though clearly displeased, the judge could find no procedural grounds to exclude them. The students immediately set to work organizing evidence, conducting additional research, and most importantly, providing constant observation that made further intimidation more difficult. Their presence drew media attention that had previously been absent, with a reporter from the state capitol arriving to cover what she termed unusual proceedings in a seemingly routine trespassing case. Maya felt the balance of power shift slightly. though she harbored no illusions about the mountain still to climb. That evening, the team gathered at a hotel conference room they had converted to a war room. "They're fighting too hard," observed one student, Tara Williams. "No one commits these kinds of resources to prosecute an 83-year-old man for walking onto an abandoned property." Another student, James Chen, had mapped the Whitfield family's property acquisitions against historical black neighborhoods. "It's not just Freedomville," he reported. "We've identified 7 distinct communities that followed the same pattern. Targeted for urban renewal, residents forced out through eminent domain or economic pressure, properties acquired by Whitfield family interests at fraction of value, then left undeveloped for decades." Professor Bennett studied the pattern. The question remains, why develop now after all these years? And why start with this specific property? The answer came from Maya's systematic review of Judge Whitfield's case records. Hidden among thousands of routine rulings were periodic sealed orders regarding environmental testing on various properties, including the Fairchild estate. Working through the night, the team pieced together a disturbing history. Whitfield Industries. The family's chemical manufacturing business had operated from 1963 to 1968 without environmental oversight. Internal memos Maya had obtained through Roosevelt's archive hinted at disposal challenges and containment concerns. Cross-referencing these dates with health department records showed clusters of rare cancers and birth defects in downstream communities throughout the 1970s and 80s, primarily in remaining black neighborhoods. A former EPA employee's sealed. Testimony from 1992 revealed limited testing that detected dangerous levels of toxic compounds in the soil near the Fairchild estate, but the investigation had been suddenly terminated without explanation. Most damning were recent geological surveys commissioned by Whitfield Development itself, showing extensive groundwater contamination that would require reporting under current environmental laws unless the affected soil was removed or permanently contained. Exactly what the foundation work for luxury condominiums would accomplish. As dawn broke, Maya received a notification that Judge Whitfield had called an emergency hearing. Rushing to the courthouse with her core team, she found Bradley Thompson, already in deep conversation with the judge. Given new information about potential witness tampering, Judge Whitfield announced once court was in session, "This court is implementing enhanced security protocols. All evidence must be submitted 48 hours in advance for review by court security. No electronic devices will be permitted in the courtroom except those belonging to officers of the court." When Maya protested that this would effectively prevent her team from accessing their digital evidence during proceedings, the judge overruled her objection. Additionally, given concerns about outside influence on these proceedings, all observers will be limited to immediate family members, of the defendant and official court personnel. This would exclude Professor Bennett's students and any media representatives. The systematic dismantling of Maya's ability to present an effective defense continued with surgical precision. Despite these obstacles, Maya scored a critical victory during cross-examination of the arresting officer. Through careful questioning, she established that the no trespassing signs on the Fairchild property had been installed only days before her father's arrest, and that the property line markers had been recently moved. Officer Davis, according to county surveys from last year, where would the property line have been located? The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I couldn't say exactly." Maya presented him with the official survey. "Would it surprise you to learn that according to this document, my father was actually on public land when you arrested him?" Bradley Thompson erupted in objection, but the damage was done. For the first time, jurors showed visible doubt about the prosecution's case. During the lunch recess, Maya received an unmarked envelope from a courthouse security guard. Inside was a USB drive containing internal emails from Whitfield Development, discussing the urgent need to begin construction before old claims resurface or the EPA gets involved. The emails specifically mentioned accelerating the timeline after learning that Washington has been asking questions about the history of the site. Maya immediately moved to enter these emails into evidence. Judge Whitfield examined them with growing anger. "These appear to have been illegally obtained. I will permit only heavily redacted versions showing the construction timeline, with all references to potential claims or investigations removed. The result was nearly meaningless fragments that lost all context and impact. Nevertheless, Maya pressed forward, determined to create a record for potential appeal. As the day's proceedings concluded, she noticed how differently courtroom security treated the two legal teams. While Thompson and the prosecution were offered assistance with their materials and escorted courteously from the building, Maya's team faced unnecessary bag searches and detained at security checkpoints. Outside the courthouse, a small group of protesters had gathered, some holding signs supporting Leroy, others with messages like "Protect Oakwood Development" and "No Outside Agitators." Among the latter group, Maya recognized several employees from the courthouse and other county offices, their presence clearly orchestrated. The day's final shock came as Maya observed the jury filing out. A young black woman, the only person of color on the jury, discreetly dropped a folded paper near Maya's table. Once the courtroom cleared, Maya retrieved it, finding a handwritten note. "My grandfather talked about Freedomville. He lost his barbershop when they seized the land. I believe you. Some of us on the jury are asking questions now." This unexpected ally offered a glimmer of hope, though Maya worried about the jurors' safety if her sympathies became known to court officials. That night, as she updated Leroy on the day's developments, he squeezed her hand proudly. "You're fighting not just for me, but for everyone they silenced. For Freedomville, for truth." His words strengthened her resolve, even as she worried about the powerful forces still aligned against them and the increasing risks they all faced as they pushed toward the truth that Oakwood's most powerful family had spent generations burying. The morning headlines in the Oakwood Gazette proclaimed, "Washington case becomes political circus," above a photo of the previous day's courthouse protesters. The article quoted legal experts questioning Maya's tactics and motivations while portraying Judge Whitfield as a patient jurist dealing with frivolous claims. More concerning was the sidebar profile titled, "Who is Maya Washington?" that dug into her previous cases, emphasizing connections to civil rights organizations described as radical activist groups. Her personal life hadn't escaped scrutiny, either with mentions of a college protest arrest that had been expunged from her record and quotes from supposedly former colleagues questioning her legal judgment. The coordinated attack on her credibility extended beyond local media. Her social media accounts had been flooded with threatening messages from anonymous accounts, and the hotel where Professor Bennett's students were staying had received calls demanding they leave town immediately. Maya arrived at their temporary headquarters, a converted storage space behind a sympathetic local church, to find the door forced open and walls spray-painted with racial slurs and threats. Computer equipment had been smashed, files scattered, and the message "Go home or die" painted in large red letters across their evidence board. The church's elderly pastor, Reverend Jackson, stood amid the destruction, his face sorrowful but resolute. "They came before dawn," he explained. "My wife heard the noise but thought it was the wind. This isn't the Oakwood I've loved for 60 years. Maya called the police, more to document the vandalism than with any expectation of meaningful investigation. 2 officers arrived, took minimal notes, and suggested the damage was likely caused by teenagers or homeless people, despite the clearly targeted nature of the attack. When Maya pointed out that nothing had been stolen, only their case materials destroyed, the officer shrugged. "Can't really dust for prints on paper, ma'am." As they left without taking photographs or collecting evidence, Reverend Jackson placed a supportive hand on Maya's shoulder. "They forget that our people are used to rebuilding from ashes." The most public attack came that afternoon during a press conference where Mayor Samuel Whitfield addressed the unfortunate controversy surrounding the Fairchild development. "While we respect everyone's right to their day in court," he stated with practiced concern, "it's troubling when outside attorneys with political agendas try to derail economic progress that will benefit all Oakwood residents." He questioned Maya's credentials and motives directly. Dr. Washington has built her career on finding racism where none exists. She left Oakwood years ago, but returns now to lecture us about our community's needs. The mayor announced additional security measures around the courthouse to ensure proceedings aren't disrupted by protesters, effectively militarizing the area and making it more difficult for Maya's supporters to gather. Most alarmingly, he revealed that the city council had convened an emergency session to expedite final approval for the Fairchild development, potentially rendering the legal challenge moot by presenting the project as an irreversible fact. Amid these public attacks, Maya's team made a crucial discovery. James Chen, who had been analyzing geological surveys, identified discrepancies between public environmental impact statements and internal Whitfield development documents. The contamination isn't limited to the Fairchild property, he explained, pointing to water table maps. Based on these flow patterns, toxins would have spread to these 3 neighborhoods over the past 50 years. He circled areas on the map that Maya immediately recognized as predominantly black communities. Cross-referencing with health department, data revealed cancer rates 3 times the county average in these exact areas, along with elevated instances of birth defects and respiratory conditions. They've known all along, Maya realized. The development isn't just about covering up historical land theft. It's about hiding ongoing environmental racism by containing the source before anyone connects these health outcomes to the contamination. When Maya attempted to submit these findings as evidence of broader fraud relevant to her father's case, Judge Whitfield not only rejected the motion, but threatened her with sanctions. This court will not be used as a platform for inflammatory accusations against respected members of this community, he declared. Any further attempts to introduce such material will result in your removal as counsel and potential disbarment. Proceedings. Bradley Thompson followed this victory by filing a motion to exclude all evidence related to historical land ownership, arguing that ancient grievances have no bearing on a simple trespassing case in the present day. Despite Maya's passionate argument that the property's history was directly relevant to her father's state of mind and his legal right to be present, Judge Whitfield granted Thompson's motion, effectively gutting the heart of their defense. This trial concerns only the events of April 15th, the judge ruled, not imagined historical injustices. With courtroom avenues increasingly blocked, Maya strategically began leaking key documents to journalists beyond the local media's sphere of influence. A respected environmental reporter from the state capital received evidence of the toxic contamination and its health impacts. A national civil rights correspondent was given the documented pattern of land dispossession and judicial collusion. Most effectively, a popular legal affairs podcast featured an interview with Professor Bennett discussing the procedural irregularities in the case without directly accusing Judge Whitfield of misconduct. These media seeds quickly bore fruit, as larger outlets picked up the story, framing it as David versus Goliath, an elderly black man and his attorney daughter fighting a powerful family's decades of abuse. National civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and legal watchdog groups began questioning the judge's refusal to recuse himself from a case involving family financial interests. This expanding attention brought both support and backlash. Several prominent civil rights attorneys offered to join Maya's team pro bono, bringing additional resources and expertise. Community members, emboldened by the national spotlight, began sharing their own stories of discriminatory treatment in Oakwood's courts and government offices. But the Whitfield family's response was swift and severe. Judge Whitfield issued a comprehensive gag order prohibiting any party from discussing the case publicly, with violations punishable by contempt charges carrying potential jail time. This court will not tolerate trial by media, he announced, though the order conveniently did not apply to official statements from court officers like himself. Maya immediately filed an emergency appeal of the gag order with the state appellate court. But knew such appeals typically took weeks to resolve, by which time her father's trial would likely be concluded. The escalating pressure took a personal toll on Maya. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since returning to Oakwood, and the constant vigilance required to protect both her father and their evidence was exhausting. During a rare quiet moment at Leroy's hotel room, she confessed her doubts, Dad, they control everything here. The courts, the police, the media. Every time we gain ground, they change the rules. Leroy took her hand, his eyes reflecting wisdom earned through decades of similar struggles. That's how systems of oppression always work, Maya. They're designed to make you feel powerless, to convince you that resistance is futile. But remember, they wouldn't be fighting this hard if they weren't afraid of what we know. His words restored her determination, reminding her that this fight extended beyond one case to challenge generations of injustice that had shaped countless lives, including her own. We don't need to win in their rigged court, Leroy continued. We just need to expose enough truth that they can't bury it again. The night before the trial's main phase was set to begin, Maya worked late finalizing her opening statement. She had sent her team back to the hotel, preferring to organize her thoughts alone in the quiet church space they had rebuilt after the vandalism. At midnight, she finally gathered her materials to leave, setting the alarm system Reverend Jackson had hastily installed. As she walked to her car, the street eerily deserted, she felt a prickling awareness of being watched. Starting her engine, her headlights illuminated a figure quickly ducking behind a nearby building. Rather than driving directly to her hotel, Maya took a circuitous route, confirming her suspicion that a dark sedan was following at a discreet distance. Employing counter-surveillance techniques learned during her Justice Department days, she eventually lost her tail and took a different route to the church, approaching from the rear entrance. Her caution proved warranted. The alarm was blaring, its warning unheeded in the empty street, and the door stood ajar. Inside, the destruction was precise and targeted. Unlike the previous vandalism designed to intimidate, this break-in had a clear objective: the theft of their most crucial evidence. The safe containing original documents had been professionally cracked. Digital backups were gone. Most concerning was the absence of the USB drive containing the Whitfield development emails. Only the material already submitted to the court remained untouched. Maya immediately called Professor Bennett, instructing her to secure their remaining copies of key documents at the hotel. As she surveyed the damage, Maya noticed something odd. Despite the thoroughness of the theft, the intruders had overlooked a weathered shoebox hidden beneath loose floorboards, where Leroy had insisted on storing copies of the most damning historical records. Sometimes old school is the best security, he had told her. With the team's digital evidence compromised, these physical copies represented their last hope of exposing the truth that powerful interests had spent generations, and now criminal actions, attempting to conceal. Are systems of justice truly equal for everyone? Or do wealth and power tip the scales? Have you witnessed how differently the rules are applied depending on who you are? Comment number 1 if you believe the media attention will finally force accountability. Or number 2 if you think entrenched power structures will find a way to prevail regardless. Like and subscribe if you value stories that expose how justice can be manipulated by those with enough influence. How far would you go to stand against a corrupt system when every institution is aligned against you? The Washington family is about to face their greatest challenge yet as they enter a courtroom where the deck has been systematically stacked against them. The courthouse steps resembled a military checkpoint on the trial's opening day. Police barriers separated a small group of Leroy's supporters from a larger contingent of concerned citizens whose matching signs suggested organized opposition. Officers conducted aggressive security screenings of anyone entering to observe the trial, with Maya's team facing particularly invasive searches. Inside, the jury selection process revealed the extent of Judge Whitfield's influence. Despite Oakwood County's 30% black population, the initial jury pool contained only 2 black potential jurors from 60 candidates. When Maya challenged this statistical impossibility, Judge Whitfield dismissed her concern as identity politics with no place in this courtroom. During voir dire questioning, any potential juror who expressed environmental concerns or knowledge of historical land disputes was struck by the prosecution for potential bias. By contrast, several jurors with direct business connections to Whitfield development were deemed acceptably impartial by the judge. The resulting jury comprised 10 white and 2 black members, with one of the latter appearing visibly uncomfortable throughout the selection process. District Attorney Prescott opened the prosecution's case with theatrical gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple. On April 15th, Leroy Washington knowingly and willfully trespassed on private property, damaged security measures, and refused lawful orders from police officers to vacate the premises. He projected photos of cut fencing and a no trespassing sign, carefully avoiding any images showing their recent installation. The defense will try to distract you with wild conspiracies and historical grievances. They'll claim Mr. Washington had some special right to be on that property. But the law is clear. Private property is just that, private. No matter what delusional beliefs Mr. Washington holds about land that hasn't belonged to his family for generations, if it ever did at all. His characterization of Leroy as a senile troublemaker with delusions about past injustices drew objections from Maya that Judge Whitfield casually overruled. Maya's opening statement faced constant interruption. The truth about the Fairchild. "Estate begins long before April 15th, she began, only for Bradley Thompson to object immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The court has already ruled historical claims irrelevant." Judge Whitfield sustained the objection. "Counsel will restrict her comments to the specific events of April 15th. Maya tried again, explaining her father's state of mind on the day in question, only to face another objection about speculative statements regarding the defendant's thoughts. By the fifth interruption, the strategy was clear. Prevent Maya from presenting any coherent narrative to the jury. When she attempted to reference the property line discrepancy established during preliminary hearings, Judge Whitfield himself interrupted. "Counsel, you are testing this court's patience. The jury will disregard any implication that property boundaries are in dispute." Maya completed her opening statement with severely limited scope, able only to assert that her father had legitimate reason to believe he was on public land adjacent to the Fairchild property, not trespassing on the property itself. The prosecution's first witness, Officer Davis, who had arrested Leroy, testified that he had found the elderly man acting suspiciously near freshly cut fencing. Under direct examination by D.A. Prescott, Davis claimed Leroy had been carrying tools that could have been used to cut the fence and had resisted arrest by questioning the officer's authority. Maya's cross-examination initially seemed effective as she established inconsistencies in the officer's account. The fence had actually been cut days earlier, according to security logs. The tools were a small soil sample collection kit with no cutting implements. And body cam footage showed Leroy calmly requesting clarification about property boundaries, not resisting. However, when Maya attempted to introduce certified survey documents showing the recent movement of property markers, Judge Whitfield sustained Thompson's objection that the surveys were technical documents requiring expert testimony, despite their official certification. The prosecution's key witness, Margaret Simmons, had been scheduled to testify about seeing Leroy on the property multiple times before his arrest. As court reconvened after lunch, D.A. Prescott announced with rehearsed concern that Ms. Simmons was unexpectedly unable to appear due to a family emergency. Maya immediately requested either postponement of her testimony or exclusion of her written statement, but Judge Whitfield allowed the statement to be read into evidence without cross-examination. The statement described Leroy as menacing and digging suspicious holes on the property, characterizations Maya had no opportunity to challenge. When Maya later learned from her team's investigation that Simmons had actually been seen boarding a flight to Florida that morning, her motion to strike the testimony was denied for lack of relevant evidence of witness tampering. Despite these setbacks, Maya scored a significant victory when cross-examining Robert Chambers, the Whitfield development executive overseeing the Fairchild project. Through careful questioning that appeared innocuous, she led him to acknowledge the accelerated timeline for development. "Would you say this project has become unusually urgent for the company?" she asked casually. "We have investors to satisfy," Chambers replied. "The market window is favorable now." Maya continued, "Favorable enough to justify doubling construction costs for expedited work." Chambers shifted uncomfortably. The board determined the additional expense was justified given certain time-sensitive factors. Maya pressed further, such as potential environmental review deadlines? Bradley Thompson objected immediately, but not before Chambers had already answered, yes, among other considerations. The exchange visibly registered with several jurors who seemed to recognize the evasiveness in Chambers' responses. The trial's momentum shifted dramatically when a courthouse clerk discreetly passed Maya a thumb drive during an afternoon recess. It contained internal Whitfield development emails discussing the Fairchild project, including explicit mentions of the need to cap the contamination before regulatory oversight increases, and references to managing the Washington problem before he connects historical dots. Most damning was an email from Judge Whitfield himself to his brother, the mayor, discussing how to expedite approvals while maintaining appearance of regulatory compliance. Maya immediately filed an emergency motion to admit these emails as evidence, arguing they demonstrated clear judicial bias and conspiracy relevant to her father's arrest. After reviewing the emails in his chambers, Judge Whitfield emerged visibly shaken but quickly regained his composure. While I will permit introduction of communications between development executives regarding construction timelines, he ruled, all other content is either privileged, irrelevant to the trespassing charge, or potentially obtained through illegal means. The result was a severely redacted version that stripped the emails of their most incriminating content. Throughout the proceedings, Maya noticed the stark contrast in how courthouse personnel treated the opposing legal teams. When Thompson requested technical assistance with presentation equipment, the court's IT specialist appeared within minutes. When Maya's equipment malfunctioned, she was told support staff were unavailable until the following day. Prosecution witnesses were escorted courteously to comfortable waiting areas, while defense witnesses were left in hallways or subjected to intimidating security procedures. Water pitchers at the defense table remained unfilled despite repeated requests, while the prosecutions were promptly refreshed. These seemingly minor indignities accumulated to create an atmosphere of institutional hostility designed to wear down Maya's resolve and communicate to observers where the court's sympathies lay. Even access to her client was restricted, with guards citing security protocols that limited her consultation time with Leroy during recesses. The day's proceedings concluded with Maya feeling both frustrated and cautiously optimistic. The jury had seen enough inconsistencies in the prosecution's case to raise doubts, even with the court's evident bias. As jurors filed out, Maya noticed the young black woman who had previously passed her a note, watching her intently. As she passed the defense table, she subtly dropped another folded paper that slid under Maya's legal pad. Once the courtroom cleared, Maya retrieved the note. "3 of us don't believe the officer. We have questions about property lines and why everyone is fighting so hard over trespassing. Keep pushing." This underground communication offered hope that at least some jurors were seeing through the prosecution's narrative, despite Judge Whitfield's efforts to control what evidence they considered. That evening, as Maya briefed her team on the day's developments, Professor Bennett offered a perspective that reframed their approach. "We're fighting 2 battles," she observed. "One for Leroy's freedom, but another for the historical record. Even if Whitfield rigs the verdict, every bit of truth we manage to get into the official transcript becomes irremovable evidence for future accountability." As darkness fell over Oakwood, a final development suggested the depths of their opponents. Desperation. A juror approached Maya in the parking garage away from security cameras. "I shouldn't be talking to you," she whispered, "but people need to know. Someone claiming to be from the court administrator's office called several of us, jurors at home. They asked if we were comfortable with the proceedings and reminded us about civic responsibility to support community development." It felt like a warning. The juror hurried away before Maya could respond, but the implication was clear. The Whitfield influence extended beyond the courtroom to direct jury intimidation. Maya documented the encounter immediately and filed a sealed motion for mistrial, knowing Judge Whitfield would likely deny it, but determined to create a record of the misconduct for eventual appeal. The battle for justice had moved beyond legal arguments to a test of moral courage for everyone involved. From the jurors facing pressure to the witnesses risking retaliation, all forced to choose between comfortable complicity and the harder path of truth. The third day of trial began with an unexpected announcement from Judge Whitfield. It has come to this court's attention that juror number 8 has engaged in improper communication with parties relevant to this case, he stated without elaboration. She is therefore dismissed for juror misconduct, and the alternate will take her place. Maya immediately recognized the dismissed juror as the young black woman who had passed her notes about jury deliberations. "Your Honor," Maya objected. Rising quickly, "What specific misconduct is alleged and what evidence supports this dismissal?" The judge's expression hardened. "The court is not required to divulge confidential juror matters. My determination is final." The replacement juror, an older white man who had expressed strong support for the Fairchild development during voir dire, but had been seated as an alternate, took his place with barely concealed satisfaction. Maya filed an immediate motion for details regarding the alleged misconduct, suspecting retaliation for the juror's sympathy toward Leroy, but Judge Whitfield denied it without consideration. The systematic removal of any potentially supportive voice from the jury represented a devastating blow to their already challenging defense. Following this setback, Maya received an unexpected lead from one of Professor Bennett's students, who had been reviewing courthouse blueprints. The student had discovered that Judge Whitfield's private chambers included a secure room not shown on public plans, accessed through a hidden door in his personal library. Older courthouse employees referred to it as the archive. Given the judge's family history and their pattern of preserving incriminating documents rather than destroying them, Maya suspected the room might contain historical records about Freedomville and the systematic land theft. During lunch recess, she enlisted Reverend Jackson's granddaughter, who worked as a courthouse administrative assistant, to create a diversion that allowed Maya 5 precious minutes in the judge's chambers while he attended an emergency call. Behind a bookshelf sliding on hidden tracks, she discovered exactly what she had hoped for: file cabinets containing decades of documents about the Freedomville Transition Project, including original eminent domain proceedings signed by Judge Uro Whitfield's father, environmental surveys documenting contamination, and most damning, a detailed inventory of items removed from Freedomville homes before their destruction, proving the organized nature of the community's erasure. Maya photographed as many documents as possible before returning to the courtroom, where she immediately moved to introduce this new evidence. "Your Honor, these documents from your private archive directly relate to the Fairchild estate's history and the legitimate interest my father had in accessing the property." Judge Whitfield's face contorted with rage as he realized the source of her information. "Dr. Washington, you have committed a serious breach of this court's security and my personal quarters. This constitutes grounds for immediate disbarment proceedings. Any evidence obtained through such illegal means is inadmissible." Maya stood her ground. "Your Honor, these documents constitute evidence of judicial misconduct spanning generations, improperly concealed in a government building. Their discovery was unfortunate but legally justified under whistleblower protections." As the judge conferred urgently with court security about how Maya had accessed his chambers, Bradley Thompson seized the opportunity to approach the bench, whispering intensely to Judge Whitfield. When the judge returned his attention to the court, his composure had been restored through visible effort. "This matter will be addressed in a separate proceeding. For now, we will continue with scheduled testimony." The afternoon brought Leroy Washington himself to the witness stand, his dignity and calm presence commanding attention despite his physical frailty. D.A. Prescott's cross-examination attempted to portray him as confused and delusional, but Leroy's responses remained measured and articulate. "Mr. Washington, why were you at the Fairchild property on April 15th? Prescott asked condescendingly. "I was collecting soil samples from land that once belonged to my parents," Leroy replied simply. "Land stolen through fraudulent eminent domain proceedings, signed by Judge Walter Whitfield in 1952. Before Prescott could object, Leroy continued, "My parents built that house with their own hands. My sister was born in the front bedroom. When they seized it, my father was given 2 days to vacate before bulldozers arrived. Jurors visibly responded to the emotion in his voice and the specificity of his memories. My father died believing the system would eventually right this wrong. I've spent 50 years gathering evidence to fulfill that belief. So yes, I return to the land that is rightfully ours, not to trespass, but to document what they buried, there before they cover it forever. Judge Whitfield immediately ordered the jury to disregard Leroy's testimony, claiming it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the trespassing charge. But the impact was undeniable. Several jurors appeared deeply moved, and one wiped away tears. When Prescott attempted to continue his questioning, Leroy responded to each attempt to characterize him as confused with clear, factual corrections, often citing specific documents and dates that demonstrated his thorough knowledge of the property's history. His testimony created the compelling narrative Maya had been prevented from presenting in her opening statement. Though Judge Whitfield ordered much of it stricken from the record, the jury had heard the truth directly from the man they were being asked to convict. In a final, powerful moment, Leroy addressed the court. "I may be found guilty of trespassing today, but history will find this court guilty of far greater crimes against justice." Following Leroy's powerful testimony, Maya introduced Walter Cunningham, an 86-year-old white former county surveyor who had worked during the period when Freedomville was dismantled. Despite pressure not to appear, including vandalism of his home the previous night, Cunningham testified that the original eminent domain proceedings had deliberately misrepresented property boundaries to seize more land than legally justified. "I was instructed to adjust survey markers to include prime agricultural land not covered by the highway project authorization," he stated firmly. "When I questioned the ethics, my supervisor said, 'They're just colored folks' land. Nobody's checking that closely.'" His testimony corroborated Leroy's account and provided the perspective of someone who had witnessed the systematic fraud from within the system itself. Most importantly, as a white professional who had nothing personal to gain, his credibility was harder for the prosecution to attack, though they attempted to portray him as senile and confused about events so long ago. The most dramatic moment came during Maya's cross-examination of Bradley Thompson himself, who had taken the stand to testify about property records and development plans. Through carefully constructed questioning, Maya led him into a verbal trap. "Mr. Thompson, when did Whitfield Development first become concerned about potential claims against the Fairchild property?" she asked innocently. "We've never had concerns about legitimate claims," he responded automatically. "The title is clear." Maya continued, "Then why does your company's internal risk assessment from last year specifically mention historical ownership disputes as a high-priority concern?" Thompson's eyes widened slightly. "I'm not familiar with that document." Maya produced the risk assessment obtained through Roosevelt's archives. "Let me refresh your memory. Page 14 states, and I quote, 'Expedited development timeline necessary to mitigate exposure to historical ownership claims and potential environmental regulatory action.' Would you care to explain what historical claims concerned your company?" Thompson glanced nervously at Judge Whitfield before responding, "That's standard legal language for any development." Maya pressed further, "Is it also standard to refer specifically to the Washington family documentation as a priority containment issue?" Thompson's composure cracked. "Where did you get that? Those are confidential internal documents." His inadvertent confirmation that such documents existed and contained references to the Washington family electrified the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, clearly connecting this admission to Leroy's testimony about his decades-long documentation efforts. For the first time, the prosecution's narrative of a simple trespassing case had been conclusively undermined by their own witness, revealing the deeper motivations behind Leroy's arrest and prosecution. Judge Whitfield immediately called a recess, but the damage was done. Maya had created reasonable doubt not just about Leroy's specific actions, but about the entire legal framework within which he was being judged. The day concluded with closing arguments scheduled for the following morning. Maya returned to their makeshift headquarters to prepare, feeling cautiously optimistic, despite the structural disadvantages they faced. The jury had seen enough inconsistencies and heard enough truth to question the prosecution's seemingly simple case. Even with a biased judge and the dismissal of their strongest supporting juror, there remained hope that the truth had made an impression. That evening, Professor Bennett shared encouraging news. Media coverage had expanded to national outlets, with several investigative journalists digging into the Whitfield family history and the environmental concerns surrounding the Fairchild development. Public pressure is building, she noted. Even if they secure a conviction, they've lost control of the narrative. Maya nodded, though her focus remained on her father's immediate freedom rather than the longer historical reckoning. Maya awakened to the sound of breaking glass. Disoriented in the unfamiliar hotel room, she fumbled for the bedside lamp, finding it unresponsive. In the darkness, she made out shadowy figures moving through her room, methodically rifling through her belongings. Sliding silently from the bed, she retreated to the bathroom, locking the door and calling hotel security. By the time help arrived, the intruders had fled, but the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Her room had been completely ransacked, clothing slashed, personal items destroyed. Most concerning was the missing case file she had been reviewing before sleep, containing her closing argument notes and copies of key evidence. The hotel security footage showed a technical malfunction during the precise period of the break-in, and police responding to her call treated the incident as a routine burglary, despite the targeted nature of the intrusion. Should be more careful in this neighborhood, an officer suggested with thinly veiled sarcasm. Lots of opportunistic crime around here. The intimidation tactics had the opposite of their intended effect, galvanizing support for the Washingtons. News of the break-in spread quickly, and by morning the courthouse steps were filled with protesters demanding justice for Leroy. National civil rights leaders had arrived overnight, holding an impromptu press conference condemning the systematic intimidation of a defense attorney performing her constitutional duty. Their presence brought national media attention that local officials couldn't control or ignore. Inside the courthouse, security measures had intensified, with metal detectors and armed guards creating an atmosphere more appropriate for a terrorism trial than a trespassing case. Judge Whitfield appeared visibly stressed as he took the bench, his customary arrogance tempered by awareness of the growing scrutiny beyond his jurisdiction. The day's proceedings were interrupted by an unexpected development. Leonard Carter, a longtime employee of the County Records Office, requested to address the court as a whistleblower with information directly relevant to the case. Despite the prosecution's strenuous objections, Judge Whitfield reluctantly allowed his testimony, likely concerned about the appearance of suppressing evidence with national media now watching. Carter testified that he had been instructed to destroy specific historical records related to Freedomville and the Fairchild property 3 days after Leroy's arrest. "I was told these were routine disposals of outdated materials," he explained, "but the records were clearly marked for permanent archival storage, and many were listed in active information requests." When Maya asked who had given this instruction, Carter hesitated before answering. Mayor Whitfield's office sent the directive, but Judge Whitfield personally called to confirm I had completed the task. This direct evidence of judicial interference and destruction of evidence relevant to Leroy's defense created a ripple of shocked murmurs throughout the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as a group of armed white men in paramilitary attire arrived, positioning themselves directly opposite the civil rights protesters. Their leader, identified by local news as James Whitfield, a distant cousin of the judge, carried a bullhorn through which he addressed the crowd. "We're here as concerned citizens to protect Oakwood's progress from outside agitators trying to derail economic development." Though they claimed to be peaceful counter-protesters, their military-style clothing, visible sidearms and formation tactics created an intimidating presence clearly designed to discourage Leroy's supporters. Police officers maintained a line between the groups but appeared notably more relaxed and friendly with the armed contingent, several officers engaging in casual conversation with them between duty rotations. Despite these mounting pressures, Maya secured another critical victory when Judge Whitfield, now under scrutiny from judicial oversight committees, alerted by Professor Bennett, reluctantly allowed limited evidence about the environmental contamination at the Fairchild site. An environmental engineer testified that recent soil samples from public land adjacent to the property showed levels of industrial chemicals consistent with decades of groundwater contamination from improperly disposed manufacturing waste. These compounds are associated with significant health risks, including the specific cancers documented at elevated rates in surrounding communities, the expert explained. Though the judge sustained objections to directly linking Whitfield Industries to the contamination, the connection was obvious to observers. This testimony established a compelling alternative explanation for the accelerated development timeline, not economic opportunity, but containment of evidence that could trigger massive liability and potential criminal charges for environmental crimes. The prosecution, sensing their case unraveling, made a desperate move. Late in the afternoon, D.A. Prescott requested an immediate conference with the judge and defense counsel in chambers. Once the doors closed, he offered a deal. Leroy would plead guilty to a reduced charge of civil trespass with no jail time and minimal fine, in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement about the property's history and environmental conditions. "This offer expires when we walk out this door," Prescott stated flatly. "Mr. Washington can go home today, or risk years in prison if the jury convicts on all charges." The implicit acknowledgement that the case had always been about silencing Leroy rather than enforcing trespassing laws was not lost on Maya. She requested 5 minutes to consult with her client, though she already knew his answer. Leroy's response was immediate and unwavering. "I didn't fight for 50 years to sell. The truth for a plea bargain. We continue." Upon returning to the courtroom, Maya found Judge Whitfield had made a unilateral decision that shocked even veteran court observers. Given the complex nature of the evidence and the late hour, this court is instructing the jury to begin deliberations immediately. Closing arguments will be waived in the interest of judicial efficiency. This unprecedented move denied Maya the opportunity to synthesize the evidence and address the jury one final time, while the prosecution had already benefited from extensive opening statements and witness examinations that shaped the narrative. Maya's objection was overruled with a bang of the gavel and a warning about contempt charges. As the jury was escorted out to begin deliberations, several members appeared confused by the irregular procedure, exchanging concerned glances as they filed into the jury room. With the jury sequestered, Maya stepped outside to brief supporters and media on the judge's unusual decision. As she returned to her car to retrieve additional materials for potential post-verdict motions, a courthouse security officer approached urgently. "Dr. Washington, you need to come with me immediately." His tone conveyed the emergency. "Police, just found drugs in your vehicle during a routine security sweep of the parking area. They're preparing to arrest you." Maya's blood ran cold. She had never used drugs, let alone carried them. The plant was transparent but effective. An arrest would remove her from the courthouse during jury deliberations and potentially discredit her in their eyes if word reached them. "I'm calling my witnesses to the car right now," she responded calmly, immediately dialing Professor Bennett and several journalists. "I want multiple cameras documenting the vehicle search and testing process, and I demand my own expert verify any substances found." The security officer spoke urgently into his radio, and within minutes, word came back that the sweep had been completed with no further action necessary. The planted evidence had mysteriously disappeared once independent witnesses were en route. As afternoon faded to evening with the jury still deliberating, an emergency evacuation alarm suddenly blared throughout the courthouse. "All personnel must exit immediately," announced the security system. "Bomb threat in progress." Court officers rushed to evacuate everyone from the building, creating chaos in the corridors. Maya immediately suspected another tactical disruption, especially when she noticed Bradley Thompson and D.A. Prescott being escorted through a side exit, while other attorneys were directed to the main doors. During the evacuation, she deliberately positioned herself where she could observe the judge's chambers, noticing several men in suits entering the restricted area despite the evacuation order. Her suspicions were confirmed 2 hours later when the all-clear was given and proceedings resumed. Judge Whitfield announced that due to the unfortunate disruption, the jury would be sequestered overnight in a hotel, with deliberations continuing in the morning. What he didn't mention, but Maya soon discovered through a sympathetic clerk, was that during the evacuation, someone had entered the evidence room and altered the official exhibits provided to the jury, removing key documents that supported Leroy's defense. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse square as Maya and her team gathered to assess the damage from the previous day's manipulation. The bomb threat had served its purpose, creating cover for evidence tampering and disrupting. Jury deliberations at a critical moment when several jurors had appeared sympathetic to Leroy's situation. Court records showed subtle but significant alterations. Property survey documents had been replaced, with older versions showing different boundaries. Witness statements had been selectively redacted to remove references to the property's history. And most critically, the environmental testing results had disappeared entirely from the official record. "They're rewriting the case in real time," Professor Bennett observed grimly, "manipulating what the jury sees during deliberation." Maya immediately filed an emergency motion documenting the discrepancies between submitted evidence and what now appeared in the court record. But with Judge Whitfield controlling which motions reached the bench, she had little hope of immediate remedy. The systematic corruption extended beyond evidence tampering. Court security logs showed Judge Whitfield had met privately with 3 jurors during the evacuation, a clear violation of judicial ethics that Maya documented in a supplemental filing to her growing record of procedural violations. Most disturbing was the revelation from one of Professor Bennett's students, who had gained access to courthouse security footage through a sympathetic IT technician showing Bradley Thompson and Mayor Whitfield entering the records room during the evacuation, exiting 20 minutes later with document boxes. Every institutional safeguard designed to ensure fair proceedings had been compromised, with Judge Whitfield's position enabling him to control not just the courtroom, but the entire administrative apparatus around the trial. The depth of corruption suggested not just bias in a single case, but a multi-generational system designed to protect the Whitfield family's interests against any challenge. While Maya battled these procedural obstacles, her research team made a breakthrough that expanded the scope of the scandal far beyond Leroy's case. Cross-referencing property records from neighboring counties revealed that the pattern of land dispossession wasn't limited to Freedomville. At least 7 historically, black communities across the region had suffered similar fates, declared blighted, seized through eminent domain or tax foreclosures despite residents' attempts to pay, and ultimately acquired by development corporations with ties to the Whitfield family and a small network of associated investors. The combined value of these properties in current real estate markets exceeded $2 billion, all built on land systematically taken from black families through manipulation of legal processes. Most alarming was evidence that the environmental contamination extended to several of these sites, with cancer clusters and birth defects documented in surrounding communities still populated predominantly by black residents. While this research confirmed the historical pattern, Maya still needed to understand the catalyst for the sudden urgency to develop the Fairchild property after decades of leaving it vacant. The answer emerged from financial records one of her students obtained through a whistleblower at the county treasurer's office. Whitfield Development Corporation had leveraged the Fairchild property and surrounding land as collateral for hundreds of millions in loans financing other developments throughout the state. Recent changes in banking regulations required updated environmental assessments for all collateral properties by the end of the current fiscal year. If the contamination were officially documented, the loans would be called due immediately, potentially bankrupting the corporation and forcing liquidation of assets, including the vast real estate portfolio built on stolen land. The development wasn't driven by economic opportunity, but by desperate financial necessity and the existential threat of accountability for environmental crimes that could include criminal charges for current Whitfield executives who had knowingly concealed the contamination. As Maya compiled this evidence, her attention was redirected by an urgent message from the courthouse. Judge Whitfield had reconvened court in her absence, claiming an emergency session. She arrived to find the judge announcing that the jury had reached a verdict after less than 2 hours of morning deliberation, a suspiciously brief period given the complex evidence and previous indications of divided opinions among jurors. Before the verdict was read, Maya filed a motion for mistrial based on judicial misconduct, evidence tampering, and improper communication with jurors, which Judge Whitfield immediately denied without reading. The jury has found the defendant guilty on all charges, he announced with poorly concealed satisfaction. This court will proceed directly to sentencing given the defendant's age and the public interest in resolving this matter. The railroading was breathtaking in its brazenness, with fundamental due process protections discarded in the rush to secure a conviction before further evidence of misconduct could emerge or higher courts could intervene. As Judge Whitfield prepared to announce the sentence, Leroy Washington slowly rose from his seat, his dignified bearing commanding attention even from those determined to silence him. Your Honor, before you pronounce sentence, I believe the court should hear what these men said when they thought nobody was listening. From his pocket, he withdrew a small recording device. When they held me captive, they didn't search an old man very thoroughly. The courtroom fell silent as Leroy pressed play. Clear audio filled the room. Washington knows too much about the original deeds. If he finds the cemetery, we'll never get this development approved. Another voice, recognizably Bradley Thompson's, responded, The judge will handle the oldie. Man, we just need to contain this until the foundations are poured. After that, no one will ever dig deep enough to find what's underneath. Judge Whitfield lunged forward, ordering, Bailiff, confiscate that device immediately. This recording is unauthorized and inadmissible. But the damage was done. Journalists present had already captured the audio on their own devices, and the explicit confirmation of conspiracy echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. The dramatic revelation triggered immediate consequences beyond Judge Whitfield's control. A representative from the State Attorney General's office, who had been observing the proceedings, rose to address the court. Your Honor, in light of evidence suggesting judicial misconduct and potential criminal conspiracy, the Attorney General's office is exercising its supervisory authority to stay these proceedings pending investigation. He approached the bench, serving Judge Whitfield with official documents. Additionally, we are requesting all records related to this case and the Fairchild estate be immediately sealed against potential destruction. Judge Whitfield's face contorted with rage and disbelief as control of the situation slipped from his grasp. This court does not recognize your authority to interrupt proceedings already in progress, he sputtered, but his usual intimidating presence had evaporated. The state representative continued calmly, Judge Whitfield, you may contest this intervention through proper channels, but effective immediately. You are temporarily relieved of authority in this matter, pending review by the Judicial Conduct Committee. As court officers moved to secure records and evidence, Maya seized the opportunity to address the broader implications. In light of these developments, she announced to the packed courtroom and media representatives, we are filing a federal civil rights lawsuit documenting the systematic theft of land from black citizens of Oakwood County through fraudulent judicial proceedings, environmental racism endangering surrounding communities, and the criminal conspiracy to cover up these violations. We are requesting immediate injunctive relief, halting the Fairchild development, pending comprehensive environmental testing and genealogical research to identify descendants of Freedomville residents entitled to restitution. The comprehensive, legal counterattack represented everything the Whitfield family had fought to prevent for generations: public exposure, financial liability, and the unraveling of wealth built on systematic exploitation. As Maya outlined the broad scope of the conspiracy extending beyond Oakwood County, those present witnessed the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape understanding of how racial wealth disparities had been institutionalized through corruption of the very systems meant to ensure justice. The headline of the Oakwood Gazette the next morning read, state overreach threatens local development, signaling the beginning of a coordinated counter-offensive by the Whitfield family and their allies. State intervention had temporarily halted proceedings against Leroy, but powerful interests were mobilizing to contain the damage. Mayor Samuel Whitfield held an emergency press conference framing the situation as outside government interference in local affairs and politically motivated attacks on a respected Oakwood family. Carefully staged supporters carried signs reading, "Jobs not lawsuits" and "Protect Oakwood's future," creating visuals for local news, suggesting community opposition to the investigation. The messaging strategically avoided addressing the actual evidence, instead portraying Maya and Leroy as opportunists, exploiting historical grievances for personal gain and threatening economic development that would benefit all residents. Local media, long influenced by Whitfield family advertising and connections, amplified these narratives while minimizing coverage of the substantial evidence of corruption and environmental crimes. The character assassination extended to coordinated social media campaigns questioning Maya's motives and professional integrity. Anonymous accounts spread false claims about her record in Chicago, suggesting she had a history of manufacturing racial controversies for publicity. Fabricated stories appeared on local news comment sections, claiming Leroy had previously attempted to extort money from developers. Most insidiously, doctored photos circulated showing Maya with radical political figures she had never met, creating false associations designed to discredit her in the conservative community. This digital disinformation campaign represented a sophisticated expansion of the Whitfield family's traditional methods of control, adapting to modern media environments while maintaining their fundamental strategy of character assassination against anyone challenging their interests. As Maya anticipated, the Whitfield family's political connections soon came into play. The state investigation that had halted court proceedings mysteriously stalled after the governor's office requested additional review of jurisdictional questions. The investigative team from the Attorney General's office found their access to county records suddenly restricted by bureaucratic obstacles, with requests that should have been fulfilled in days, stretching to weeks without response. When Maya contacted her source in the Attorney General's office, his response was concerning. "There's intense pressure from the governor's office to handle this quietly. The Whitfields have donated millions to key campaigns, and several state officials have investment ties to their developments. The political machinery that had protected the family's interests for generations extended far beyond Oakwood County, creating a buffer zone of influence that had effectively contained previous challenges to their power." Despite these obstacles, Maya pressed forward with a two-pronged strategy, pursuing federal intervention while simultaneously building public pressure through strategic information release. Her meeting with federal prosecutors initially seemed promising, as civil rights violations and environmental crimes fell under federal jurisdiction, potentially bypassing the state-level corruption. The lead federal prosecutor, Samantha Morris, appeared genuinely concerned by the evidence Maya presented. This pattern of land dispossession through judicial manipulation clearly warrants investigation, she acknowledged, and the environmental data suggests knowing endangerment of public health over decades. However, her next statement revealed the limitations they still faced. That said, we have to recognize practical constraints. Statute of limitations has expired on many of the historical claims. For current charges to stick, we need to focus narrowly on recent actions rather than the entire historical pattern. This pragmatic approach threatened to fragment the case Maya had built, demonstrating the continuity of discrimination from historical land theft to present-day cover-up. The contemporary crimes only make sense in historical context, she argued. They're finishing what their grandfathers started. Morris nodded sympathetically but remained firm. I understand completely, but federal prosecution requires focus on provable current violations. We can use the history as context, but charges must center on actions within the statute of limitations. This limitation embodied the very structural challenges that had allowed intergenerational wealth transfer through discrimination to persist. Legal systems designed to address discrete incidents struggled to encompass systematic patterns extending across decades. The justice system's fragmented approach to time and responsibility created gaps through which accountability for historic injustice consistently slipped. While these legal battles progressed, the Whitfield family launched their most direct attack yet on Maya personally. The Illinois Bar Association, responding to multiple credible complaints, suspended her law license pending investigation of alleged ethics violations. The suspension notice cited questionable trial tactics, misrepresentation of evidence, and inappropriate client solicitation without providing specific instances or evidence. The timing and vagueness of the charges clearly indicated their retaliatory nature, but the practical effect was devastating. Maya could no longer represent her father or file court documents in any jurisdiction while suspended. Professor Bennett immediately stepped in as interim counsel, but the disruptive impact of removing the attorney who had built the case from the beginning was precisely what the Whitfields had intended. Combined with freezing her law practices, accounts, the suspension created both professional and financial pressure designed to force Maya to abandon the increasingly costly fight. With legal avenues narrowing, the Whitfields attempted a different approach. Bradley Thompson arranged a meeting with Professor Bennett, ostensibly to discuss potential resolution options. The settlement offer he presented was financially significant, $5 million for Leroy personally, with additional community development funds for Oakwood's black neighborhoods, in exchange for comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and withdrawal of all claims. This represents a genuine desire to heal community divisions and acknowledge historical concerns, Thompson claimed smoothly, while allowing progress that benefits everyone to continue. The offer's subtext was clear: take the money and walk away, allowing the fundamental power structure to remain intact while creating the appearance of reconciliation. It represented the classic strategy of preserving systemic advantage through selective concessions, offering individual compensation while preventing institutional accountability or structural change. Professor Bennett conveyed the offer to Maya and Leroy with professional neutrality but evident skepticism. Financially, it's substantial, she noted, but the non-disclosure provisions are absolute. No one would ever know the truth about Freedomville or the environmental contamination. The decision ultimately rested with Leroy, who had suffered most directly and had the most to gain from immediate compensation. His response came without hesitation. My parents died believing their land was stolen through legitimate legal means. They carried that shame to their graves, thinking they'd failed to protect what they built. Millions of dollars can't buy back their dignity or erase that injustice. He looked at Maya with fierce determination that belied his physical frailty. We didn't come this far for a payoff. We came for truth. His principled rejection of financial settlement in favor of historical accountability represented the moral core of their fight, prioritizing community justice over individual compensation. The struggle took an unexpected turn when Maya's strategic release of information began yielding results beyond Oakwood County. Descendants of Freedomville residents living across the country learned of the case through social media and national news coverage, many discovering for the first time what had happened to their family land. They began coming forward with additional documentation, photographs of homes and businesses that had once thrived there, deeds and letters preserved by grandparents, family stories of displacement that suddenly contained new context. This growing chorus of voices transformed the narrative from one family's legal battle to a community reclaiming erased history. A Freedomville Descendants Association formed virtually overnight, with members contributing to a legal defense fund and sharing family records that helped complete the historical documentation. Their collective voice created public pressure that no individual lawsuit could generate, bypassing traditional legal constraints through the power of unified testimony, as in P. These developments created momentum. The Whitfield family made their most desperate move yet. Leroy Washington, recovering at a rehabilitation facility following the stress of trial and captivity, barely survived an apparent poisoning attempt. An attendant with no prior connection to the facility had accessed his room and added an unknown substance to his food before being noticed by another staff member. The attendant fled before security arrived, but was captured on surveillance video. Local police initially classified it as a random incident, despite the clearly targeted nature of the attack. But federal prosecutors, now fully engaged in the investigation, immediately recognized it as a murder attempt designed to silence the central witness against the Whitfield conspiracy. The brazen attack on an elderly man in medical care shocked even those who had previously remained neutral in the conflict, turning public opinion decisively against the increasingly desperate tactics of those trying to suppress the truth about Freedomville and its legacy. The attempted murder of Leroy Washington crossed a line that even the Whitfield's political connections couldn't shield them from. The FBI took command of the investigation, executed search warrants simultaneously at multiple Whitfield properties, including the offices of Whitfield Development, Judge Whitfield's home, and the mayor's residence. The comprehensive evidence they uncovered expanded far beyond Oakwood County, revealing a multi-generational conspiracy involving judicial corruption, environmental crimes, tax fraud, and civil rights violations. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrested Judge Harrison Whitfield, Mayor Samuel Whitfield, and 6 executives from Whitfield Development, including Bradley Thompson, all charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and various financial crimes. The speed and scope of federal action reflected the seriousness with which attempted murder of a federal witness was treated, bypassing the local power structures that had protected the family for decades. The federal investigation uncovered what decades of local acquiescence had concealed. In a forgotten vault at Oakwood National Bank, agents discovered a comprehensive archive of Freedomville records, meticulously preserved by the Whitfield family, not out of historical interest, but as protection against potential claims. The documents included original property deeds, census records, business licenses, and church registries documenting the vibrant community that had been systematically erased. Most damning were internal memos from the 1950s, explicitly discussing the strategic acquisition of black-owned land, with one from Judge Walter Whitfield stating, "The prosperity of these people represents a dangerous precedent. Acquisition of their property serves both economic and social stability objectives." The naked expression of racist motivation, preserved in the family's own records, shattered any pretense that the dispossession had been legitimate urban development rather than calculated racial expropriation. As federal charges expanded, Leroy Washington recovered sufficiently to witness the beginning of justice he had sought for 50 years. From his hospital bed, he watched news coverage of the Whitfield arrests with quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. This was never about vengeance, he told Maya, who rarely left his side. It was about truth having its day finally. The federal court officially exonerated him of all trespassing charges, acknowledging in its ruling that the prosecution had been a transparent attempt to silence legitimate inquiry into historical injustice and ongoing environmental crimes. Beyond this personal vindication, Leroy witnessed the broader impact of his persistence as national media began extensively covering the Freedomville story and similar cases across the country, creating new awareness of how seemingly neutral legal processes had been weaponized to transfer wealth and property from black communities throughout the 20th century. The environmental dimensions of the case brought additional federal intervention. Comprehensive testing revealed the Fairchild estate contained dangerous levels of industrial chemicals, improperly disposed by Whitfield Industries decades earlier, with contamination spreading through groundwater to predominantly black neighborhoods nearby. The EPA designated the area a Superfund site requiring intensive remediation, with cleanup costs charged to Whitfield Development and its insurance carriers. Health screening programs were established for current and former residents of affected areas, revealing elevated cancer rates and other conditions consistent with long-term toxic exposure. This environmental justice component transformed understanding of the case from historical land theft to ongoing endangerment of lives, with current Whitfield executives facing criminal charges for knowingly concealing public health hazards in pursuit of profit and to avoid liability. The historical significance of the site received formal recognition when the Department of Interior designated the Fairchild Estate and surrounding Freedomville area as a National Historic Site, permanently protecting it from development. Archaeological teams began carefully documenting the cemetery Leroy had shown Maya, identifying graves and working with descendants to create appropriate memorials. The planned luxury condominiums were permanently cancelled, replaced by a community-led initiative to create a memorial and educational center, preserving the history of Freedomville and similar communities nationwide. The Freedomville Descendants Association played a central role in designing this memorial, ensuring the community's achievements and resilience were emphasized alongside the injustice of its destruction, creating a space for both remembrance and education about patterns of dispossession that shaped American cities throughout the 20th century. The legal consequences extended beyond criminal charges to civil liability. Maya, her law license reinstated after the fabricated ethics charges were exposed as retaliatory, led a class action lawsuit on behalf of all descendants of Freedomville residents and those affected by environmental contamination from Whitfield Industries. The federal court certified the class, opening the door to substantial damages for hundreds of families whose economic trajectories had been dramatically altered by the theft of their ancestral property. Financial experts calculated the compounded value of the stolen land at current market rates, factoring in lost intergenerational wealth transfer that had contributed significantly to the racial wealth gap in the region. This economic analysis transformed abstract historical injustice into concrete financial terms, quantifying how prosperity had been systematically transferred from one community to another through manipulation of legal systems ostensibly designed to protect property rights equally. Maya's experiences fighting Oakwood's entrenched power structure led her to establish the Land Justice Initiative, a national legal foundation dedicated to researching and challenging similar patterns of land theft nationwide. With support from civil rights organizations and law school partners, the initiative created a database documenting over 300 similar communities that had been systematically dispossessed through various legal mechanisms, from eminent domain abuse to predatory tax foreclosures to outright fraud. This comprehensive mapping of displacement patterns revealed the extent to which current distribution of property wealth had been shaped by racially discriminatory practices, often implemented through seemingly neutral legal processes. By connecting these historical dots across jurisdictions, the initiative created a new framework for understanding and addressing systemic property injustice beyond individual cases. 6 months after the federal investigation began, Leroy Washington stood beside his parents' newly marked graves in the restored Freedomville Cemetery. The autumn leaves rustled around marble headstones that had replaced the weathered markers, each bearing the names and dates of community members whose final resting place had nearly been obliterated beneath luxury condominiums. Surrounded by descendants from across the country who had traveled to commemorate their shared history, many meeting cousins for the first time at this gathering, Leroy spoke words that captured the essence of their multi-generational struggle. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. The metaphor resonated with profound truth as the assembled families represented the flowering of resistance that had grown from what the Whitfields had attempted to erase, their very presence a testament to the failure of systemic efforts to destroy not just a community, but its memory and legacy. As the Freedomville Memorial and Education Center broke ground on the site of the former Fairchild Estate, the community-led development represented a fundamental shift in who controlled the narrative and future of the land. Former residents and their descendants collaborated with historians, environmental experts, and civil rights advocates to create a space honoring both the vibrant community that had thrived there and the broader patterns of resilience in the face of systematic dispossession. The center would include restored buildings based on original photographs, oral histories from former residents, environmental education about the continuing impact of industrial contamination, and legal history, documenting how property law had been weaponized against black communities nationwide. This multi-layered approach ensured that visitors would understand Freedomville not as an isolated incident, but as a window into structural forces that had shaped American cities and wealth distribution throughout the 20th century. The final twist in the long saga came from an unexpected source. During sentencing hearings for the convicted Whitfield family members, federal prosecutors revealed that much of the evidence leading to their downfall had come from within their own circle. Thomas Whitfield, Judge Harrison's grandson and a recent law school graduate who had been working at the family's firm, had been anonymously providing documents to Roosevelt Jenkins and later to Maya's team throughout the investigation. When asked by the court why he had turned against his own family, Thomas responded simply, "I was taught in law school that justice matters more than loyalty. When I discovered what my family had built their fortune upon, continuing that legacy became impossible." His testimony about overhearing conversations about eliminating evidence and intimidating witnesses proved crucial to securing convictions of family members who had believed themselves untouchable. His choice represented the possibility that even the most entrenched systems of privilege could be transformed when individuals within them chose accountability over complicity. As Leroy and Maya Washington stood together, watching the sun set over land that rightfully belonged to their family once more, they reflected on the journey that had led them to this moment. What had begun as a simple trespassing defense had evolved into a reckoning with history that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community's understanding of its past and future. "Your mother would be proud," Leroy said softly, referring to his late wife who had supported his decades-long quest for truth about Freedomville. "She always said that justice moves slowly, but it doesn't stop moving as long as someone keeps pushing it forward." Maya nodded, understanding now why her father had never abandoned this fight despite seemingly insurmountable odds. The seeds of justice he had planted decades ago had finally broken through hardened ground, creating the possibility of healing not just for their family, but for all those whose stories had been buried beneath layers of institutional power and historical erasure. The truth once unearthed could never be reburied. Buried justice teaches us that systems designed to protect power often masquerade as justice. The Whitfields used courts, police, and government institutions meant to serve everyone equally to continue generations of oppression. Yet the story also reveals that persistent truth-seeking can eventually overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Leroy's 50-year quest demonstrates that justice requires both stubborn determination and strategic alliance building. Maya's legal expertise alone wasn't enough. They needed community support, media attention, academic resources, and ultimately federal intervention to break through local power structures. The story shows how racial injustice compounds over time. Land theft created wealth disparities that gave the Whitfields the resources to continue oppressing others. Environmental racism added another layer, as those with power could literally poison communities with impunity. Most importantly, we learn that history isn't just about the past. The Washingtons weren't fighting old grievances, but ongoing harms with present-day consequences. True justice requires not just acknowledging historical wrongs, but actively repairing their continuing damage. Finally, Thomas Whitfield's choice reminds us that moral courage can emerge from unexpected places, and that systems change when those who benefit from injustice refuse to perpetuate it. Has a powerful institution ever made you feel helpless in your fight for what's right? Did you persist or give up? Comment below with justice if you believe persistence against corruption is always worth it, or reality if you think sometimes the cost is too high for one person to bear. The Washington family's story reminds us that justice often requires community support who would stand beside you in your darkest hour. Like this video if you believe in holding powerful interests accountable, and subscribe to support more stories that expose how systems meant to protect us can be weaponized against the vulnerable. Share with someone whose courage inspires you to stand firm when facing impossible odds. Remember, in the words of Leroy Washington, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." Thank you for bearing witness to this story of resilience, and may you find the strength to confront injustice in your own community.